Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. I'm Hamilton, and today we're going to be talking about shutting down my first startup, LineTimes. We're going to go into why I decided to shut it down, and also what I learned from that, and what I'm going to take forward into my future business projects. So let's get started. So let's start with my first startup and what it is to give you some context going forward. So my first startup was called LineTimes, and the point of it was to provide real-time wait times at grocery stores. So you could go in and you could see, for instance, oh, the line at the East Village Trader Joe's on 14th Street is 40 plus minutes, or maybe it's 2 hours, or maybe there's no line at all. The reason I built this was largely because I had observed that there were long lines at grocery stores. For some context, pre-COVID, anecdotally, peak times could get above 40 plus minutes to an hour, and then during COVID itself, the lines were even longer, up to 2+ hours, wrapping around avenues and blocks. And so I kind of figured, all right, this is kind of weird. I'm sure people don't intentionally stand in these really long lines, particularly when you can just go in off-peak hours and have shorter lines. So maybe this is something I can build a business on. Of course, now I've tried it and have a pretty good idea that no, I cannot build a business on this. That's why I shut it down. But that was the premise of the business. So before we go into why LineTimes itself failed, I want to talk a little bit about startups themselves. Startups are very just risky ventures. In fact, one of the numbers I just pulled is that about 90% of startups fail. I think that's actually pretty low. I would actually bet that even more than that actually fail. I'd assume more fail in the early stages before they even become startups or like real things. But bottom line is that lots and lots of startups fail. So bring that back to LineTimes. It sucks that LineTimes failed, but I'm not surprised by it. I assumed that this would, have a pretty low chance. It's just kind of an average startup. So I'd thought through this before and kind of put some boundaries and some systems in place to make sure that I was keeping that risk in mind and managing it to the best of my ability. And some ways that I have done this are by setting constraints for win and lose scenarios. And so these are useful because by setting it at the beginning of a project, it allows you to ensure that you're going in the right direction, or you're keeping in mind the end goals as you go through all the steps of creating, a project. And it does this in several different ways. One, it forces you to track your success measurements or your critical, metrics, because if you don't know those metrics, then you can't compare them to your win and lose scenarios, and therefore you can't know if you're winning or losing or even going in the right direction. So I think that's a good side effect of it. Another one is that it forces you to stay within bounds for reasonable risk and cost. So let's say that you only have a budget of about $1,000 to stand up your startup. Well, that's a pretty hard lose scenario if you end up spending about $2,000 or $3,000. But in the heat of moment of building your startup, if there's emotions or we've been working 60-hour weeks or whatever, that can be easy to lose track of. And the last one is that it forces you to just accept that if your thing is failing, you need to just get out. There's no point in just over-investing in a bad bet. That's really just, whether it's a sunk cost fallacy or whatever it is, you have basically at this point figured out this isn't matching my expectations. Don't throw more resources at it. And so I wanted to frame that, before we talk about LineTimes and how exactly it failed, to kind of just show you kind of where my head's at and how I'm thinking about these things, because it has a pretty far-reaching impact on why I did some of the things I did. And I think it's just a good framing starting point. So now that we have that perspective going forward, we can now talk about LineTimes itself. So Through my analysis and reflection, I think that LineTimes failed for two primary reasons. The first is that it couldn't prove that it had value to its target users. And the second is that it had a bad value to cost ratio. All right, so let's talk about reason number one for failure, which is no proof of value. When I created LineTimes, I did create it with a win constraint, and that win constraint was mainly for the first few milestones, just to understand, is this something I need to invest in or not? And what I was trying to capture is, how do I know that this thing I've created is producing the value that I think it's producing, and that the target users that I want to be using this are receiving that value. They are actually leveraging it. And the way I thought about this was, okay, what is the point of this product? And really it's to show people the wait times at grocery stores. So how do I know if it's providing value? Well, I have some data on people coming to my sites and people maybe searching for things like this. So if I can just somehow prove that they're using this before they go to grocery stores, then that should be a pretty good blunt assessment of whether it's providing value or not. And so the number I came up with was, if I could find 100 recurring visitors, 100 unique users that are coming back multiple times a month, I put that as 4+, then that was a good sign that people were actually using this tool regularly for the purpose that I had originally created it for. Now, to be honest, this is the only constraint I actually created for my project. I should have also created a lose constraint, but I didn't do that. For now, the win constraint that I'd created for myself was 100 users a month that are coming 4+ times each month, to roughly coincide with a weekly grocery trip. So now let's get into LineTimes' actual performance. As you might have guessed, it didn't hit that win constraint, which is how I determined it wasn't proving that it had value to its target users. So in actuality, the site got 52 unique users over 3+ months, which is just about 17 a month, and far less than that 100 total that I wanted. Because I didn't even get to the 100 users a month, I didn't even do the analysis on whether they were coming back and reusing it, because it just didn't matter. It wasn't providing value to enough people to actually show that it was being useful. Now, I did try several different methods of getting more people to the site and to try out the service, so I could gather more data and really, understand if it was providing that value or not, or if people were just kind of hitting and leaving. But obviously those didn't work out. Just to name a few, I obviously was talking to friends and family about this site, particularly those in New York, to see if they wanted to use it on their regular grocery runs. Posted a lot on my different socials, my IG, my Twitter, shout out, go follow me there. And featuring it in all of my blogs and videos, kind of like this, where I'm talking about something I've created, but it's not just about promoting it. It's actually talking about some sort of feature of that. I got a little creative, and I saw that people were waiting for 2+ hours around the block on city streets trying to get into a Trader Joe's. So I created some signs, and I would just walk out there and kind of stand out in front of the Trader Joe's and walk up and down the lines to make sure that everyone kind of saw it. But even that wasn't enough to drum up attention and interest in the site. Cool. So at this point, we know that LineTimes wasn't in a win state, but also because I didn't have that lose constraint, it wasn't really in a lose state. So we're kind of at this point where maybe LineTimes will get more people to come, and maybe it'll eventually hit that win state with just more time. But that's what will bring us to the second reason for failure, and that is going to be bad value cost ratio. So the second reason for failure is really what kind of pitched it over the edge and really gave me confidence that shutting down was the right thing to do. So let's talk real quick about cost as a failure constraint. Obviously, there's a case where, if you only have $1,000 budget for something, you can't go over the $1,000. So if you are going to do that, then that's, a pretty obvious failure constraint. For me, it's a little different. I don't have a set total budget, but I do have a budget per month that I try to stay inside of. And for me, that's about $200 a month that I put just towards my projects to try to give them, some capital to start out with. But for this project itself, I guess in general, I try to stay within that budget. But for this project itself, I didn't actually set a failure constraint, which is, something I should have done, but it's something that I didn't do. So because of that, I didn't really know what I was willing to pay or lose in this venture. And so this one really came about as kind of an intuition that this thing isn't providing enough value for the amount of cost that I am sinking into this venture. Now, there's no one way to decide this. For me, it was kind of a feeling, and now this idea that I should have a lose constraint in the future. But I think usually a good one is this thing profitable? I think you should have, probably some sort of budget, whether probably a monthly budget or something over time budget. And then also, if this thing is profitable, then that helps even it out a little bit. Like if it's not profitable, but you're not losing that much money on it, maybe it's okay to let it ride. But if if it's not profitable and it's like really not profitable, then you should think about possibly exiting at that point. For LineTimes, it was a little different because this is like a pre-revenue construction. I didn't ever build out a way to make revenue through it. And so the profit thing didn't really apply, but at the same time, it was losing money, and so that still would have fit a lose constraint kind of like this. So let's talk about LineTimes costs. In total, I ended up paying around $90 a month to host and run LineTimes. That breaks down to about $50 a month for the cloud hosting, hosting on Google Cloud, and about $45 a month for its internal APIs and data fetching. So these are like, figuring out how busy a place is and stuff. I had to pay for those APIs, and so that was like a necessary cost for actually running a site like this. I'll be sharing more about LineTimes system architecture and how it works, as well as how I'm hosting a lot of things going forward. So if you're interested in learning more about that, hit the subscribe button, and we'll have some of those out in the coming weeks. So back to LineTimes, we are getting about 17 users a month, and I'm paying about $90 a month to keep the service running. It's not a ton of money, $90, and if I was getting like 1,000 users a month, or seeing some of that recurring value, then that would have made it harder to shut it down, particularly when I don't have a lose constraint set. But $90 a month for about 17 users really made it a hard case to say that it shouldn't be shut down. And that's kind of where we got to. The value to cost ratio just wasn't holding up, and that, in addition to us not showing the value that I wanted to show, really made it pretty clear decision that I need to shut this down. And so I ended up killing the project. As I mentioned earlier, it does suck to kill a project like this, something that you want and hope to succeed. But I think it's often the right move. If you are seeing signs that this thing isn't doing what you think it should do, it's probably not going to be successful, it's a money pit, any of these things, you really need to think about exiting in some way so that you can focus all your resources on something that has a better chance of succeeding, and that you actually maybe want to work on. I'm really big on the philosophy that you should just create a lot of different startups that will increase the likelihood that one of those will be successful, and so that you should really just make a lot of cheap bets, cheap, fast failures, and then if one starts to working or starts looking like it's working, really just double down on those. That's probably one of the more efficient ways of allocating your resources. Obviously, I haven't gotten a successful startup, so we'll see with time, but that's pretty much how I think about things these days. And side note is one of the main reasons why I've committed to building a project a month, or project in a time frame, because I think it forces you to kill bad bets early and really just invest in the good bets. Cool. So yeah, I ended up killing LineTimes. I think it made a lot of sense. Now I'm starting to look towards building new things. So this section, I'm going to talk more about, reflecting on what didn't go so well in LineTimes so that I can use it to be better in these future projects that I'm starting. So the first thing that I would change, or I'm going to change in my project building systems, is that I'm going to force myself to have win and lose constraints on the outset of a project. So I've talked about this a lot, but these constraints really help keep you on track and allow you to know if you're going in the right direction, and also keep you with a pretty high velocity from wasting resources in bad bets that just you should have moved on. I think the total implementation opportunity for me here is probably in the hundreds of dollars, just even on this one project. It was lucky that, or perhaps a little bit lucky that I was paying so much for LineTimes, because I was constantly thinking about like, why is this thing so high? It's literally taking money on my bank account every month, and that made this calculation pretty easy. But if it had been a little bit cheaper, maybe I wouldn't have decided this for several more months, and those costs could have added up for several $100s. The second big thing that I'm trying to change is to start actually talking to real users. This is something that all sorts of actually successful entrepreneurs say is like key to winning, and something that I just still have yet to do. For this project in particular, I had data showing that people weren't really finding this thing valuable, but I couldn't really understand why they didn't find it valuable. It solved the problem as I saw it, but I'm not necessarily the target user. So, for instance, when I was walking around with that sign, I probably should have asked some people like, hey, have you visited LineTimes? How long have you been in, this line? Like, did you know the line was going to be this long? Kind of stuff like that to help me course correct, not just on the data or, whether I'm solving the problem I set out to be solving, but also like, am I solving a real problem? Am I solving the right problem? Should I like change the direction or my goals even? And so that's something that I'm going to start changing about my systems. Lastly, I'm going to start using better and cheaper infra. So, I was looking back on this project and I was like, man, $50 to host this site that's not even doing that much is like pretty high. Is there a way I can get that a little bit lower? And so I did some research and kind of saw what other people were doing and was applying that to what I was trying to get my sites to do. And yeah, found like there's actually a lot cheaper options, even with much of the same tools that I was using. So I'll be using that going forward. I think I can get my hosting down to about $10 a month for similar projects, which is way more attractive than the $90 for LineTimes. Of course, that included external APIs, so really that would have gotten it down to like $55, but still way better than a $90 number there. I'll be sharing more about that and like how I decide to host things in the future. So again, yeah, subscribe if you want to learn more about that stuff. And that's it. So that's why I killed LineTimes. It was just not proving that it had a lot of the value that I wanted it to have, and it also was just costing me too much for the value it was showing. I did learn a lot in this process, and I'll be implementing those in my systems, and I'm sure in the next startup and the startup after that and the one after that I'm going to continually be learning and seeing kind of where my systems are failing me. So yeah, thanks for watching, and if you're interested in getting more updates about the things that I'm building, all these learnings, how I'm absolutely failing at startup life right now, subscribe. I'd love to share this with you. All right, till next time.